The mouse of the day is Strange Stanley, and everyone knows he's strange, but no one knows why he's strange. Until now. This is the mouse origin story on why Strange Stanley is so strange. When he was born, he was just a regular mouse, much like all the other mice in the village. He was small with soft gray fur and curious eyes, and for the first few years of his life, Stanley showed no signs at all of being anything but an ordinary, happy young mouse. But of course, that all changed one fateful day. The day Stanley wandered into Toxic Tobias's lab. Toxic Tobias was not your average mouse. He lived on the outskirts, far away from the rest of the mice, in an old crumbling burrow that was more like a fortress than a home. It was said that Tobias was once a brilliant scientist, but something had gone wrong, terribly wrong, and he had been experimenting with dangerous radioactive substances ever since. Most mice avoided Tobias and his lab at all costs, afraid of the strange glowing lights that sometimes came from his windows and the ominous smell of burning chemicals that wafted through the air. But Stanley, being a curious young mouse, had no such fears. He had always been fascinated by stories of inventions and discovery, and the thought of a mysterious lab filled with all kinds of strange equipment was more than enough to pique his interest. One afternoon, when he was still a very young mouse, Stanley decided to go exploring. His parents were busy with chores and the sun was shining brightly overhead. Perfect conditions for an adventure. Now, the moment Stanley stepped out of his family's burrow, his mind was already made up. He was going to visit Toxic Tobias's lab. The journey to Tobias's lab wasn't far, but it felt like an eternity to Stanley, who was buzzing with excitement. As he got closer, the air seemed to change, growing colder and more still. The burning scent of chemicals filled his nose, and strange green smoke rose in thin wisps from the chimney. Most mice would have turned around right then and there, but not Stanley. He was just way too curious, too eager to see what lay inside. He reached the front door of the lab and hesitated for only a moment before pushing it open. The door creaked on its rusty hinges and Stanley stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the eerie green glow that seemed to fill the entire space. Strange machines whirred and clicked, and glass beakers filled with bubbling neon liquids lined the shelves. The air was thick with the smell of burning metal and something sour, like spoiled milk. Stanley wandered deeper into the lab, his eyes wide with wonder. He didn't even notice the figure hunched over a table in the far corner. Toxic Tobias was muttering to himself as he mixed chemicals in a large bubbling cauldron. Stanley heard rumors about Toxic Tobias's experiments, but seeing the lab in person was something else entirely. It was both thrilling and terrifying. As he wandered closer to one of the shelves, something caught Stanley's eye. A small piece of cheese sitting on a metal tray. This cheese glowed with an eerie green light, its edges pulsing as if it was slightly alive. Stanley's stomach grumbled. He hadn't eaten since breakfast, and despite the strange glow, the cheese looked, well, it looked delicious. Without thinking, Stanley reached out and grabbed the piece of cheese. It was warm to the touch, almost too warm, but Stanley didn't care. He took a bite. The moment the cheese touched his tongue, Stanley's world changed forever. At first, there was nothing, just the familiar taste of cheese, sharp and tangy, but then, Strange Stanley felt something deep inside him, something very, very wrong. His stomach churned and his vision blurred. His tiny paws trembled and he felt a strange heat building up inside him. The green glow of the cheese seemed to intensify, and before Stanley could make sense of what was happening, a wave of nausea hit him. He stumbled back, dropping the remaining piece of cheese. He started going crazy. His limbs felt like they were on fire. His muscles were twitching uncontrollably. He gasped for air, but the room seemed to spin around him, and the green glow from the cheese seemed to just grow brighter and brighter and brighter, until it was all he could see. He was just seeing green everywhere. Then, just as quickly as it started, it all stopped. Stanley collapsed to the ground, panting and sweating. His body felt different, lighter, almost weightless, but he couldn't figure out why. He was dazed and disoriented, but Stanley tried to stand up. When he did, he felt an odd sensation in his neck. He ran his paws along it, horrified to find that his neck had stretched like a piece of string pulled taut. It was pencil thin, fragile, and strangely flexible. His heart raced as he looked down at his body, trying to figure out what else could have changed. His paws were trembling, his fur standing on end, and his tail twitched uncontrollably. His vision was sharper than before, and he could hear everything. Everything. From the bubbling of the chemicals in the cauldron to the faint hum of the machines in the background. Stanley felt like he was vibrating, like every cell in his body had been charged with some strange, powerful energy. Just then, Toxic Tobias turned around, finally noticing the young mouse standing in the middle of the lab. His eyes widened in shock when he saw Stanley's pencil-thin neck and trembling body. "What in the name of cheese happened here?" Tobias muttered, stepping closer to inspect the boy. His sharp eyes quickly darted to the half-eaten piece of glowing cheese on the ground. "You ate it?" Toxic Tobias gasped, horrified. "You ate the radioactive cheese!" Stanley, still in pain from the effects of the cheese, could only nod weakly. He opened his mouth to speak, but the voice came out as a faint, high-pitched squeak. It was as if his vocal cords had been altered by the cheese. Tobias shook his head, muttering under his breath. "I was working on that cheese for months, trying to stabilize the radioactive isotopes. It wasn't ready, nowhere near ready, and you ate it." He let out a long sigh, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Well, kid, I hope you're ready for a new world of strange, because that cheese is going to change you. Forever." Stanley's eyes widened in fear. Change me?" he squeaked, his voice cracking. Toxic Tobias nodded grimly. "Oh yes. You've absorbed a massive dose of radiation. Your body is going to start behaving differently. You're going to start feeling very strange. Very strange." Stanley's heart pounded in his chest. He had heard stories about mutations and strange powers that would come from radioactive exposure, but he had never imagined something like this happening to him. He looked down at his thin neck, his paws trembling, his tail was twitching, and he was so scared. He felt really, really strange. Toxic Tobias watched him for a moment and then shrugged. Well, there's no one doing it now. You're going to have to live with it, kid. You might develop some unusual abilities, or maybe not. Who knows? Radiation is very unpredictable. Stanley swallowed. Oh, what do I do now? Tobias gave him a long, thoughtful look, then sighed. You get out of here before you get in more trouble. And maybe stay away from any more glowing cheeses, huh? Stanley did not need to be told twice. He bolted out of the lab, his heart racing, his paws trembling, and his mind spinning in fear and confusion. He ran all the way home, not stopping until he was safely tucked away in his own burrow. But even there, in the safety of his own home, Stanley couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer the same mouse that he was when he left in the morning. Days turned into weeks as Tobias had predicted. Stanley began to notice his changes more. His neck remained pencil thin, unnaturally long, and his body felt off. He was faster than before, quicker on his paws, and his senses became heightened to an almost unbearable degree. He could hear conversations from across the village, smell cheeses from miles away, and see in the dark as if it were daylight. But the strangest part of it all was the way other mice looked at him now. It was as if they could sense that something about Strange Stanley was different. They whispered behind his back, stared at his strange neck, and they kept distance from him. Stanley, once a curious and friendly mouse, found himself increasingly isolated. He became known as Strange Stanley, the mouse with the pencil-thin neck who never quite fit in, and while he learned to live with his new abilities, he could never forget that fateful day in Toxic Tobias's lab, the day that changed him forever. As the years passed, Stanley embraced his strangeness. He was a walking reminder of the dangers that lurked in the unknown, a strange and solitary figure with a neck that stretched like a string, and a story that no one could quite believe. But Strange Stanley didn't mind. He had found his place, even if it was on the edges of a normal life. And though he would always be known as Strange Stanley, deep down he just felt like Stanley. So that's the story of how Strange Stanley became so strange. And now he's become even more strange because he's just been living like a weird mouse for so long that he's developed some more strange habits. No one knows if it's from the radiation or just from being strange for so long and sort of being ostracized by society. But he'll just stand in random parks and stare at you with his eyes wide open, and he'll sprint straight at you in a strange manner. Sometimes he'll just pull up to random events holding a block of cheese and nibbling on it super strangely and super ominously, staring people down. So I think this radiation did a number on him, but also just the social isolation of being sort of not accepted by society since he ate that radioactive cheese and developed this pencil-thin neck. So he's very, very strange and weird. I kind of feel bad for him, though, and I mess with him. I mess with him even though he has stared at me in a super strange way with his eyes wide open and just sprinted really, really fast to catch me as I was running away from him. He's still strange and weird for that. I wish he wouldn't have done that, but I mess with him. Do you guys mess with Strange Stanley?